On May 2nd, 2011, if their claims are to be believed, Navy SEALs found Osama bin Laden hiding out in Pakistan, killed him and much of his family, and dumped his body at sea. They figured out where he lived by pretending to be healthcare workers distributing a vaccine, so people have been killing healthcare workers trying to distribute vaccines in Pakistan ever since. Although the Obama administration tried to make a big deal out of the extrajudicial killing of this man, no one has ever claimed that the war on terror ever ended. Any claim like that would be too obviously nonsensical, with the rise of all kinds of new groups. The bipartisan post-9/11 consensus holds as true in the post-Bin Laden era as when he was still alive. The war on terror has no end, and it can be waged anywhere, anytime.
It was a commando operation of courage and skill. Navy SEAL helicopters flew in for the kill. They had a firefight, and they shot him in the head. Now the mastermind of terror, Bin Laden, is dead. For all those who love freedom, it's a glorious day. In D.C. and New York, they're chanting USA. Fatherless children clutching teddy bears. Legless veterans with catheters and wheelchairs can all rejoice that the deed is done, and the war on terror has been won. Now orphans of Afghanistan can look at the skies. They can fill the air with joyful cries as the call to prayer rings from shattered domes. They can all run out from the rubble of their homes. Now they know their parents didn't die in vain when they heard the roar of a jet plane. Now the whole village except the 115 who died that morning unknown and unseen can all rejoice that the deed is done, and the war on terror has been won. Now folks can have a party in old Baghdad, and the people of Fallujah can all be glad. Now they know there is a reason for their poisoned farms, and for the babies born without heads or arms. The widows need not wonder where their husbands went. They can look forward to the future in their tents. Now all the refugees, whatever country they're in Syria, Jordan, or Michigan, can all rejoice that the deed is done, and the war on terror has been won. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea.
It seems that the mass slaughter of innocents has become more and more common over time. In warfare, fewer and fewer of those killed tend to be combatants these days. More and more from the U.S. wars in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, or under Israel's bombs in Gaza or Lebanon, it's about the mass killing of civilians. Those the West calls terrorists then respond to this mass slaughter of civilians with things like the attacks on the World Trade Center, or in the subways of London or Madrid, or the streets of Brussels, Berlin, Lyon, or Paris. And sometimes the fanatic with guns, bombs, and intentions to kill is a blonde Norwegian whose victims are mostly other Norwegians, as in Oslo and Utøya in July 2011. On the face of it, it seems like an especially bizarre expression of a certain form of far-right nationalism and xenophobia until you consider history. The history of Europe is full of Europeans killing other Europeans for believing the wrong thing or for being part of a community that adheres to a certain religion or division of one. During the various inquisitions, crusades, and pogroms, this sort of thing got especially bloody. I was in Norway only a couple weeks after that terrible massacre in the center of Oslo and on the island of Utøya. There were still massive numbers of flowers beginning to rot all around the Oslo Cathedral. The many broken windows of the government buildings that was bombed were still boarded up.
They say he acted alone for a Europe white and free, a sick and twisted man from an otherwise sane society, the image of Aryan blonde, almost iridescent, with a manifesto quoting from the Crusades to the present. But he stood on many shoulders, of this we can be sure, a millennia of xenophobes who slaughtered to be pure, since before the first crusade, when a mighty Christian band hacked and stabbed and burned their way to the Holy Land. They say he acted alone, but in his mind he was another of those who came before him, his mighty Christian brothers, who rode covered in armor and served their masters well. They vowed to chastity, they vowed to kill the infidel. They marauded west and east in the name of Christendom. They killed Jews, Muslims, pagans, fellow Christians by the thousand in the name of Jesus. From the Jordan to the Rhine, the red cross on their chest plates, their terrifying sign. In the shadow of the Knights Templar, in the shadow of the Knights Templar. They say he acted alone. No one said this of the Pope, whose victims were left burning or hanging from a rope. The Lord's own Inquisition for 6 centuries, the ethnic cleansing of a continent, a Christian tyranny. European Jews and European Muslims led the Christian Caliphate to be protected by the Sultan. For 500 years they prospered beneath the Turkish sky. For those left behind, convert or die. In the shadow of the Knights Templar, in the shadow of the Knights Templar. They say he acted alone, but he's living in a country where the xenophobic right is the second biggest party, and he's living on a continent that is overrun with prime ministers who tell us multiculturalism is done. They brag of their traditions, they swell with Christian pride for the civilization built on genocide. Anders Breivik pulled the trigger, but he did not write the play. That script was being written 1,000 years ago today. In the shadow of the Knights Templar, in the shadow of the Knights Templar. Alone, and they want us to believe that moderating rhetoric is the best we can achieve. But moderating rhetoric will bring us nowhere near to the understanding that the problem is right here. European empires, European greed, European Christians poison European seeds, European racists running European states, European tolerance for European hate. In the shadow of the Knights Templar, in the shadow of the Knights Templar.
Meanwhile, in Orlando, Florida, in July of 2011, the authorities were doing what they had done hundreds of times in San Francisco and so many other cities around the U.S. and the world, arresting Food Not Bomb's founder Keith McHenry and a number of other folks for daring to serve free meals in a public park. Since Food Not Bombs began in 1980s Boston and then became more well-known in the San Francisco Bay Area, where Keith moved after he lived in Boston, it has spread as a meme, as a basic concept to emulate around the U.S. and around the world. Serve food for free in public with no permit, and because the name of your operation is Food Not Bombs, even if it's for no other reason than that, you are serving food as a protest against military spending in some capacity, and the authorities tend to get that idea, and they don't like it. In the U.S., the gentry usually makes sure to keep poor people as out of sight and out of mind as possible. This may not be entirely feasible this far into the housing crisis, but the powers that be try hard with various measures, and when it comes to free food, it should be served in some dark church basement, not in the park in front of City Hall, and not without a permit. We can have other kinds of disorder, but not that kind.
In the land of Minnie, Mouse, and Mickey, things are getting icky since the municipality of Orlando, Florida, passed a moratoria against feeding hungry people in their city. The mayor said with a scoff, we'd all be better off without these food terrorists lurking like a shark. So he did declare, Samaritans beware, no more feeding hungry people in the park. And if you do, you'd better raise your bail, 'cause you'll be fined $500 and sent to jail. Yes, if you do, you'd better raise your bail, 'cause you'll be fined $500 and sent to jail. There are many things you can do when you're passing through that are much more acceptable than that. Go on amusement rides, eat things that are fried, buy each one of your kids a little hat. You can stay in a hotel, pretend everything is swell, go to SeaWorld and hear the seals bark. But whatever else you have in mind, you will be in a bind if you feed the hungry people in the park. And if you do, you'd better raise your bail, 'cause you'll be fined $500 and sent to jail. Yes, if you do, you'd better raise your bail, 'cause you'll be fined $500 and sent to jail. A good time, have a good vacation, then retire. But if you want to stir up trouble, if you deign to pop the bubble and try to feed the hungry people of the Shire, in such a public place we can't suffer such disgrace, though the logic may seem a little stark. What would the neighbors say? Where will the children play if you keep feeding hungry people in the park? And if you do, you'd better raise your bail, 'cause you'll be fined $500 and sent to jail. Yes, if you do, you'd better raise your bail, 'cause you'll be fined $500 and sent to jail.
In August 2011, there were riots all across the cities of England. Notably, there were not riots in Scotland, where things are run differently in various ways apparently not lost on the locals at the time. The riots in England were inspired, one could say, by the usual toxic mix that starts with a society very divided by class and race, then with a large helping of police brutality added for good measure. My impression wandering around the cities of England around that time was they were most welcoming, burnt or not, but if you are trying to sell electronics anywhere, you'd better have a good insurance policy. The searing lead guitar you'll hear in this song is played by none other than Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine.
The cop shot another man, they have that kind of knack. And it may not be coincidental that he was black. He was sitting in his car, they say he might have had a gun. What we know for sure is he had 5 kids, daughters and sons. Now he can't have a family, he'll never see his friends. His neighbors understand what kind of message this sends. Some life is worth less, some life is worth more. You don't have to be a mathematician to know the score. Some people get shot just for being who they are. Some people play with iPads, take vacations, drive in fancy cars. Some people go to universities, some people do not. It depends on where you were born and how much money you got. The government cuts their spending, widening the divide, then reacts with disbelief when they face the rising tide of anger at the cuts of the futures that they rob. With each day so many have to live without a job. Now the flames are getting hotter, they keep coming to your town. London is burning down. Cameron went on TV in his suit and tie. If the riots asked the question, then this was his reply. We'll arrest these hooligans, these people without shame. They are only criminals, and it's only criminals to blame. Morals have decayed among the peasants' ranks, so let us lock them up while we bail out the banks. When that's the way they look at it, it's not very hard to watch things fall apart in this house of cards. Now the flames are getting hotter, they keep coming to your town. London is burning down. People whine. These kids have too much freedom, and all this is just a sign that we need more policemen to teach them some respect. Well, if that's your line, then I know just what you can expect. The class will be repeated until the lesson has been learned. All you need is some injustice to make your cities burn. All you need is the perception, whether or not it's true, that most of us will never live the way you do. Now the flames are getting hotter, maybe coming to your town. London is burning down.
If you're a leftwardly oriented person from the US or Canada who was around in 2011, what you might remember most are the Occupy Wall Street encampments in all the cities that fall. That was an idea that caught on. It started as a protest in Zuccotti Park on September 17th in Manhattan. I was there. I had been at other protests at Wall Street before that ended with the police flooding the streets and making sure everyone else knows who's boss. I was expecting the same to happen this time, but people kept coming back. And then people started setting up encampments in the middle of the financial districts of cities around the U.S. and Canada. I had a tour planned that was taking me all over the U.S. and Canada throughout the fall of 2011 as it happened, so I got to visit 30 Occupy encampments before I lost track. It was inevitable that such a sustained presence in parks across the country like Occupy had going for months couldn't go on forever, especially when faced with obstacles like regular police brutality. But while it lasted, Occupy was a daily reminder for many people about the vital importance of holding public space like that. Occupy also served as a reminder that was simple enough to get picked up by the mainstream press, that for so many people, the division in society that really matters is the one between the 1% and the 99%.
Because this is where they buy the politicians. Because this is where power has its seat. Because 99% of us are suffering at the mercy of the madmen on this street. Because all of us are victims of class warfare being waged on us by the 1%. Because these greedy banksters rob the country, leaving us without the means to pay the rent. Because the last time that we had a decent government was about 1932. Because we the people are supposed to run this country, but instead it's all run by and for the few. Because now we know the rich do not pay taxes, but when they need a hand it's us who bail them out. Because we suspected we lived in a plutocracy, but suddenly of late there is no doubt. So we're gonna stay right here. We're gonna stay right here. Because both my parents lost their savings, because I have never opened an account, because the interest on my credit card just doubled, and now I can't pay the minimum amount. Because these budget cuts are just immoral, that our schools as overcrowded as they are. Because there are no buses where I live, but I can't afford to drive a car. Because so many of us don't have health insurance, the rest of us have it, but it sucks. Because the rich are flying in their private jets, while the rest of us are slogging through the muck. Because capitalism isn't working, this system has just failed to produce. Because the 1% are prospering, while the rest of us just suffer their abuse. So we're gonna stay right here. We're gonna stay right here. Because it has been demonstrated amply that the winners are the ones who stick around. Because this world should belong to everyone, not just the banksters who had smashed it to the ground. Because we've noticed voting doesn't change things when the politicians are mostly millionaires. Because we're learning how to stand up like Tunisians, like they did in Tahrir Square. Where a young man named Mohammed Bouazizi struck a match that lit up all the earth. And all around the world the spell was broken, and a movement for the future was in birth. Because there's only so much the rich can feed us before we figure out which side we're on. Because we've learned if we want our liberation, it will only come if we stay here till the rising of the dawn. So we're gonna stay right here. We're gonna stay right here. Because corporations are not people, and we can't just let them choose. Because if we leave our fate to them, then all of us will surely lose. Because the climate clock is ticking, and we can't just leave our world behind. Because corporate rule isn't working, and it's time for humans' hearts and minds. Because you can't take it with you, because the rich just do not care. Because it doesn't matter how much you make, but how much you can share. Because these moments don't come often, because we want truly to be free. Because we know what really matters, something called society. So we're gonna stay right here. 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 We're gonna stay stay right here. We're gonna stay right here. We're gonna stay right here.
Stand Your Ground got some national media attention when George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin on February 26, 2012. The fact that Zimmerman was nowhere near his own ground, nowhere near his or someone else's home, and he had to get out of his car in order to pursue the teenage Martin on the sidewalk where he was walking, but he was still able to successfully claim that he was standing his ground, was seen by the general public as outrageous for obvious reasons.
Boy went to visit his father out of town, where he had moved to an upscale neighborhood. It rains a lot in Florida, and it was raining on that night, but everyone says exercise is good. He went out for a walk to the convenience store to go out and bring some candy back. But some people leave and they never come home, and that night was a one-way track. For the neighborhood watchman was driving in his car on a rainy night, looking for a young man who might have a part to play in his personal race war. And what if this trolling vigilante, sowing terror on a racist whim, what if when he found this teenage boy, he instead had found a man more like him? What if things were different? Where would he be bound? What if Trayvon had stood his ground? When Zimmerman approached in an unmarked vehicle, when the high school student ran, what if instead he had stood there in the rain with his Skittles and his Arizona can? What if, trying to avoid a conflict with this cracker who was evidently messed up in the head, Trayvon had said, "I feel like my life's in danger," and he had shot this vigilante dead? What if things were different? Where would he be bound? What if Trayvon had stood his ground? Would this hooded youth be gingerly arrested, treated for his wounds and then let free? Would he be hailed as a hero by the NRA, by Limbaugh, Beck, and Hannity? Would he be found not guilty by any jury in this country? Would he be allowed to keep his gun? Or would he be sitting in a prison cell watching pundits on the TV saying, "That kid really should have run"? What if things were different? Where would he be bound? What if Trayvon had stood his ground?
On June 4th, 2012, when CeCe McDonald was physically assaulted at a bar in Minneapolis, and she retaliated against her assailant after he followed her outside, stand your ground didn't seem to apply. These rules seem to vary depending on who is perceived to be the victim and who is perceived to be the perpetrator.
lot of white men in this world who turn out a lot like Dean Schmitz. Homophobic, racist, bigoted, and mean. He grew up to be a hard man, did the things that hard men do. Picked fights, went to prison, got a swastika tattoo. CeCe McDonald is a child of creation, and she's black and she's trans, an often deadly combination. She went out with friends one night, as friends often do, which is where she met the man with the swastika tattoo. CeCe McDonald wasn't looking for a fight. She was just out for the evening to have a drink, perhaps a bite. For Dean Schmitz, the same thing was not true. That's how it is when you're a guy with a swastika tattoo. Dean said things to CeCe which I shall not repeat here, about her race, about her gender, about all things he thought queer. CeCe and her friends tried not to take the cue. Not so the man with the swastika tattoo. First blow was from a bigot, a beer mug to the face, which left CeCe bleeding all over the place. CeCe left the building, but then the next thing that she knew, she was confronted by the man with the swastika tattoo. CeCe left the building, she didn't want to stay. She went out onto the sidewalk, she tried to get away, but when the Nazi came to get her, she did what she had to do, and she stabbed him in his swastika tattoo. But sometimes you can improvise, so she tried her sewing scissors on for size. Turned out they were sharp, turned out her aim was true, and it was the last day for the man with the swastika tattoo. CeCe called the cops, and they took her off to jail. She was sentenced to 3 years, but she lived to tell the tale. That's one more woman who's still breathing, and one less Nazi who had upon his chest a swastika tattoo.
In the spring of 2012, the leaders of the G8 and the leaders of NATO thought it would be a nice idea to have a big joint convention in Chicago. As the word spread that we were planning on having a big protest there for the occasion, they thought better of having both NATO and the G8 convening together, and at the last minute they moved the G8 convention to Maryland, and just NATO had their meeting in Chicago all by themselves. At the main rally in Chicago, the sound system mysteriously didn't work until just after the time when the music part of the program was supposed to be over. This kind of thing happens frequently at rallies in the USA, quite possibly far too often to be chalked up to either coincidence or incompetence. Something else that happens frequently, which was also in evidence in Chicago, were police infiltrators getting involved with organizing protests and then framing people for alleged crimes, like claiming someone with home brewing equipment was planning on manufacturing petrol bombs. Meanwhile, in NATO-occupied Afghanistan, the drone strikes against villages and wedding parties continued.
50 heads of state came to threaten and to boast, to articulate their message and together make a toast to the new schemes they're hatching, to the next regime they'll change, to the next nation they'll turn into a bombing range. They hyped it on the radio, newspapers and TV, the anarchists who come and destroy the city. The anarchists who come and the undercover cops, the old Chicago Red Squad and their psyops. It's the cops who bought the petrol, the cops who bought the cans, the cops who brought it home, the cops who made the plans, so they got the terrorists they wanted. Now they're doing fine, they got the terrorists and they got the headlines. I wanna know who, wanna know who is the terrorist? Wanna know who, wanna know who is the terrorist? Meanwhile in Afghanistan, another family is dead, wiped out in their sleep as your thoughts might be impure, while the generals fly their air force all the way across the ocean. They'll build military bases, drop bombs of all description. But if you drive from Florida to the city of Chicago to pay a little visit to Mayor Rombo, watch out for the cops who bring home the gasoline, and your apartment becomes a crime scene. I wanna know who, wanna know who is the terrorist? Wanna know who, wanna know who is the terrorist? Meanwhile in Afghanistan, a village has been hit, a wedding party transformed into a pit, transformed into a graveyard for children, women, men, transformed into a graveyard for empire again, a place where terrorists are born with every drone attack, a graveyard for the Midwest boys never coming back, a graveyard for society, a graveyard for ideals, a place to bury all the hearts of anyone who feels. And at the meeting in Chicago, they'll talk of women's rights, they'll talk about the terrorists they've got within their sights, the terrorists abroad, the terrorists so near, the terrorists who grew up in a suburb around here. I wanna know who, wanna know who is the terrorist? Wanna know who, wanna know who is the terrorist? Meanwhile in Afghanistan, more protesters shot down by NATO troops who had to prove it's them who run this town, by NATO troops who have to show they are in control, while it all comes crashing down in the countries they stole. NATO troops committing war crimes every day, ruling over nations in the old imperial way. The lying generals in Chicago with their satellites and tanks, taking orders from their bosses, the oil men and banks taking orders from their bosses, looking suitably enraged at terror, foreign and domestic, real or staged, whether led on by informants or just pissed off by the war. The terrorists are meeting behind closed doors. I wanna know who, wanna know who is the terrorist? Wanna know who, wanna know who is the terrorist? Who is the terrorist? Wanna know who, wanna know who is the terrorist?
For millions of working musicians around the world, 2013 will be remembered as the year we stopped selling CDs. This was the year the biggest music streaming platform of modern times, Spotify, made a deal with the big three record labels and rolled out their free tier. Just about all the world's music, aside from albums of artists like me that they decide to ban on occasion, for free. The struggle for artists to make a living suffered a big blow in 2013, while big tech got closer to its goal of total dominance of everything.
If each time a song were streamed, I received 1 cent, this is exactly what I'd need each month to pay the rent. I made that calculation. Looking at the stats, must be a lot of other people wearing the same hat. The concept may not be perfect, but in the streaming age, if we want to form a movement, it could be the first stage. The idea is very simple. Set up some ground rules, otherwise big tech makes trillions, plays the rest of us for fools. Now I'm just dreaming about the day we might get a penny a play. It would not be a revolution, but as sure as the world is round, it'd be helpful to know how far you fall before you hit the ground. I'm a DIY musician, who knows for how long. What we need is union, so this is a union song. Now I'm just dreaming about the day we might get a penny a play.
Penny a play, penny a play, penny a play, penny a play.
They say they're losing money, they'll say it to the end. But if you want to pay the landlord, you gotta have it to spend. Your labor should be valued. No need to genuflect. A tiny fraction of a cent is not enough respect. Now I'm just dreaming about the day we might get a penny a play.
Penny a play, penny a play, penny a play, penny a play.
These vulture capitalists in Stockholm and San Francisco play their shell games and think that we don't know that they are getting rich from the music that we made. At what point do we start getting paid? Now I'm just dreaming about the day we might get a penny a play.
Penny a play, yes.
We might get a penny a play.
Penny a play, yes.
We might get a penny a play.
One of the many problems with the oil and gas boom in North America in recent decades has been how to transport the stuff to wherever it needs to go. Generally, the options are leaky pipelines, trains that derail, or trucks that crash. It's possible to operate a 72-car train with just one person aboard, and so in 2013 that's exactly what was happening. Late one night in July, 72 cars full of Bakken crude rolled downhill, and in the center of the Quebec town of Lac-Mégantic, they exploded, destroying the town center and killing 47 people. After that, Canada improved rail safety slightly, requiring a second person to be involved with operating those long trains full of explosive liquid. The lesson we either heed or ignore each time such a disaster occurs is capitalism requires strict regulation in order to operate safely. Otherwise, it's liable to do whatever's most profitable, which is likely deadly for a lot of people.
There's an oil boom. The prairies are on fire, shale gas. All the fuel you might desire coming out so fast. No time to lay pipeline, Eurekaville. It's like the days of 49, except this time they're using massive rigs that poison everything more thoroughly. The deeper that it digs, trains a mile long. Loaded up in rail cars, send them west, send them east. Past cafes, schools, late night bars, there's an oil train coming through your town. There were dangers. They knew this from the start, but they were minimal. They said everyone must play their part and risk the destruction of their cities. Each time a train rolls by, hope it won't derail and detonate sky high. There's an accident each day somewhere, but we're not supposed to fear that it could happen here. Listen closely. Do you hear that whistle blow? Look out the window. Do you see the fire glow? There's an oil train coming through your town. It was after midnight on a Saturday night. A resident called in that a rail car was alight with that much gas. Sitting by the lake, it was no one's job to watch the car that maintained the brake on 73. Massive tanks of fracking gas down the hill, gaining speed as they rolled past. Now at the Music Cafe that once was on Rue Frontenac, there are 50 customers and employees who won't be coming back. There's an oil train coming through your town. There's an oil train coming through your town.